Well, welcome to West End Resilience Live. You don't need me to tell you what an important week this has been. I'm sure I wasn't the only one to watch the queues outside reopening shops and note what a milestone it was for the West End. And with the confirmation that we now have a drug to treat COVID-19, it really does feel like we have turned a major corner. Today, we're keeping it local as we're joined by Cllr Rachel Robathan, who is the leader of Westminster City Council. She'll be taking us through what the council has been doing to help with reopening and recovery and what their long-term aims are for the West End. This will be followed, of course, by an opportunity for you to put your questions to her. But first, let's cross over to Jace Tyrrell, Chief Executive of New West End Company. Jace.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. And good afternoon, West Enders. Welcome back to West End Resilience Live with our partners at Microsoft. Of course, we have our members, our partners and our friends at the West End joining us this afternoon. So as Martin says, we've started to gradually and safely open the West End retail this week. And what a wonderful milestone to see our colleagues returning to work and customers coming back in a safe way following various measures that we put in place with our partners over the last couple of weeks. Of course, we have a long journey ahead, and as we move into the opening, hopefully, of hospitality and leisure in early July, we're still pushing the government very hard on a couple of key areas that's really going to help the West End into our recovery over the weeks and months ahead. Firstly, we are calling for this immediate review of the 2 to 1 metre. We feel very strongly, as amongst many in the industry, that we have to move away from social distancing being the default position and actually better treatments, a vaccine, hopefully, and also other measures to help like track and trace really should allow us to move away from the 2 metres, which is going to be so vital for the West End's recovery moving forward. The quarantine, again, we feel very strongly we need a level playing field, particularly of our international customer base. And we need to make sure that London and the UK is on a level playing field with other parts of Europe and around the world so we can start to welcome our customers back later this year and into 2021. And finally, the ability to trade outdoors. And I'm sure our keynote speaker will touch on this, but the semi period over the summer where perhaps we can deregulate some of these planning and licensing regulations to allow our hospitality businesses to trade outside and make it safer on our streets is going to be so critical to support the retail sector in the West End. So we are thrilled we have the leader of Westminster City Council who's able to join us today. It is such a key partner working with the leader and her team at City Hall on a range of areas, both strategically and operationally, to support our bit of the West End. And I was very pleased when Rachel became the leader in December, which seems a lifetime ago, given what's happened in the last 3 to 4 months, that she set out very boldly some of her key priorities, which is very much aligned to what we're trying to achieve in the West End. This commitment to the climate change emergency of becoming carbon neutral by 2040 as a city. And of course, all of us want to support that endeavour. Oxford Street District Transformation, £150 million committed to make this one of the best examples of global leisure and retail centres in the world right across the district. And also perhaps a reset on how the business community through the Westminster bids, the Westminster Property Association can work with Rachel and her cabinet and senior officers at City Hall to really show the value of business in the neighbourhoods and the communities that we work in. So I'm sure Rachel will touch on some of these topics when she addresses us in a moment, but really a thank you to all of you on the efforts to date to get us open safely this week. And now we move into a new phase of how we work through recovery and hopefully at some point the renaissance of the West End moving forward. But for now, over to Rachel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jace, for that really generous introduction. And it's our pleasure to work with NWEC, which is such a key organisation in supporting and driving the West End and really delivering the best for that area. So it's a really key partner for us in Westminster, because obviously the West End is such a vital part of Westminster's life and economy. And it's a real pleasure to be joining this week because obviously it's an important week for the West End. We've seen the shops reopening, the non-essential shops, after a very long period. And although some of the scenes outside Nike weren't ideal in terms of social distancing, I am so thrilled that we've seen people coming back in their numbers, because quite clearly, until we actually started this, we didn't know how many people were going to come back. It is quite an issue to try and gauge how people will feel about confidently coming back into the city centre. So to see people out and about, keen to spend money, which is always good, and keen to come back to the West End is really exciting. But before I come up onto talking a little bit more about what we've done very recently to support this, let me talk about a few of the things that the council's done through this period, because as Jay said, it does seem a lifetime ago when I took over as leader, even though it was only 6 months ago, and a huge amount has changed for all of us in that period. The council has, I hope, risen to the challenge. We won't have got all things right, but I think I'm so pleased with what our officers have done and the work that's been done. We have, with the exception of libraries and leisure centres, which had to close, we have kept all of our other services running. So all of the things around keeping our streets clean, waste recycling, of course, the services to the vulnerable, noise services, all our services continue to operate as normal, which is I think really important. Also planning and licensing functions, albeit in a virtual way. We have set up a platform, Westminster Connects, to bring together all of the people who wanted to volunteer to support their community effort and to link those with people in need. And I've also been it's been fantastic how many businesses have wanted to be part of that as well. Hotels, restaurants, all sorts of other groups, shops who've wanted to do things for the community. And I think that's been a really positive sign of showing how the business and residential community of Westminster are knitted together and have come through this together. We've also been engaging, been keen to engage as closely as possible with groups throughout this period. I mean, clearly there's been a huge amount of hardship and tough times, but we've been really clear that we want to work with everyone, obviously with our resident community, but also with all sectors of the business community as well. So just last week, I joined a call with all of our five-star hotels, but also cultural institutions, and also with the bids, clearly, and other landowners and all sorts of other groups, and that's been really important. We've also launched a Shop Local campaign, which I hope everyone will support. And we have on our website, we have a map which has been kept up to date with all businesses across Westminster which have kept open and are offering a delivery or collection service through this period. So we hope that that's a way that we can inform all of our resident community what's still open and available, but also to help businesses through this period, which has been so critical. So let me come on to what we've done to really support, we hope, as much as we can, the opening of the retail sector. So Jace mentioned the work with government, and I can tell you we have been lobbying very, very hard across all sorts of areas. And in fact, I was very pleased that one of the first things that was raised, that we were able to raise, was the importance of the bids and their role in terms of supporting the business community. And I was very pleased that the government did announce a 6.1 million fund for bids, which recognises the key role that bids play in terms of helping our business community to recover and survive through this period. But we've also been really hard at work lobbying across a number of areas. One of the most important ones was, it seems a lifetime ago now, the budget in March, but many of you will remember that the Chancellor announced business rates relief for the retail, hospitality and leisure sector for all businesses with a rateable value of less than 51,000. Well, of course, in Westminster, that meant only 5% of our businesses, because business rates relief, business rates are so high. So I wrote the same day to the Chancellor, and I was very pleased when he did remove the cap. And I think that's been really enormously helpful for many businesses. And yesterday I was on Mottcombe Street in my own ward, and I was really struck. 3 businesses off their own bat just said, it's been really tough it's been touch and go, but we've been able to survive because we haven't got to pay the business rate. So I know that's been really important. More recently, we realised that we needed to be very bold in terms of putting in place measures to allow people to move safely around. You know, this is all about confidence. How can we encourage and support people to be confident to come back to the West End, to come back to the other parts of our city, to move around safely, and how will they feel that they will you know, be able to go to Regent Street or Oxford Street or anywhere else and not have to be bumping up against other people and can do so safely. So we knew that when the government asked us to look at ways that we could create additional footway space, etc., we needed to be ambitious, and I think we have been. We've created 19,000 square metres of additional temporary footways, a lot of it in the West End. You'll have seen the schemes along Regent Street, Oxford Street, etc. We've created 11 kilometres of additional cycleways, 800 additional cycle parking bays, more signage, all sorts of other measures. And we've also, of course, worked with NWEC and supported their measures as well. So I think together we have done as much as I think we could have done. We also produced a guide for businesses on how to manage queues, which is surprisingly difficult and complex, actually, particularly when you've got retailers next to each other, all having to manage their own queues, but also to be very clear on the guidance of how you manage this. And I think that's all part of, all of those are ingredients of how we can make people feel confident that the West End is well managed and safe, and that they should feel able to come back and have an enjoyable day in the West End. So that's all been part of that. Moving on, Jace mentioned about the hospitality sector, and that's clearly the next big issue. And the government has, although they haven't absolutely confirmed it, we are expecting them to say that the 4th of July will be the date when the hospitality sector can reopen. Now, as many of you will know, in Westminster, we have a very large hospitality sector. We have almost 7,000 shops, but we also have almost 4,000 food and beverage outlets. So this is really critical. We are the biggest licensing authority in the country. We're the biggest planning authority in the country. We represent 9% of business rates. So it's an important issue for Westminster. So we yesterday launched quite an ambitious, I think very exciting programme for how over the next few months, and we've been very clear that this we would do on a temporary basis because it will need temporary closure of some roads. We have announced over 50 schemes which will enable the hospitality sector to extend their tables and chairs outside. Clearly, the areas that are most affected by this are the areas with a high food and beverage concentration, so in Soho, Chinatown, and other parts of the West End, but also Marylebone, Mayfair. There are schemes across most of the city where there is a high food and beverage focus. We've worked really closely with our resident population, resident community around this, because let's be absolutely honest, we are asking residents, and we're in the same boat. We're asking to accept something which normally we probably wouldn't. But we all understand that the hospitality sector desperately needs to have this extra flexibility to enable it to get off its knees and be able to trade again. We need our high streets, we need our retail areas, but we also need our restaurants, our bars, our cafes. It's what makes Westminster, let's be clear. So we need to do what we can to support them. And I think it's absolutely right that through this period, we put in place these additional measures. And I hope it will be something, you know, if we let's hope and pray, have a nice summer, it's going to be fantastic. We'll all be able to you know, go outside and eat outside and feel confident and safe that we're able to do so within whatever the guidance is. As Jace mentioned earlier, it's clearly the issue around the 2-metre rule is being considered by the government. I know no more than you, but it's clearly being considered, and so it may be that is amended. But please do look on our website for the specific proposals. These aren't set in stone. Some may come out, some others may be added, and of course we can add more as we go along. But our very clear agenda as a city council is we want to work with our resident community, but we want to do everything we can to support our hospitality sector and our retail sector to get up and running again. As part of that, we are also working on quite, once again, ambitious proposals for how we can reduce some of the traffic on our roads. And by that, I mean how we can work to consolidate freight movements and also commercial waste collections and deliveries, how we can improve the way deliveries are working. So we're going to be working very closely with our landowners and the bids, etc., to look at how we can all rationalise some of that traffic in the centre of our city, because clearly the more we can do to rationalise that traffic, the more flexibility we've got for some of these other measures that we're talking about. So those are the sort of immediate challenges that we have in the West End, but longer term, of course, there's so much more that we want to be doing. And as mentioned at the beginning, when I took over as leader, I was very clear that to say, as well as a very clear commitment to meeting the climate emergency target of being carbon neutral as a council by 2030 and by a city as by 2040, which are very punchy targets, but you know, we know that we need to do even more to improve air quality and tackle carbon emissions. So we are working at pace on that. We've also said that in light of that, and I think particularly actually in light of recent events, we want to be even more ambitious on our plans for the Oxford Street district. We remain absolutely committed to this. Oxford Street and that whole area, the Oxford Street district, is a really important part of our city, and we want to invest in it and move it forward. But if we're going to go to this effort, we want it to be really fit for the future. So let's be ambitious about it. Let's look at how we can use smart technology to really future-proof the city and to include all the things that we would really want to do. So that is part of a piece of work that we're doing at the moment, revisiting those plans. It has to be said, it's slightly been put on hold over the last 3 months while we've dealt with a few other things, but we are absolutely focused now on how we can relook at our plans, be more ambitious, and make sure that we are delivering the best scheme that we can. As we go forward, I think there's going to be things that we all have to address in terms of how areas like the West End look, the sort of mix of retail that we will have, how people do travel and move around more confidently, and that those are part of a discussion and a debate that I think we'll all have as we come through this. But we feel really excited about the prospects for the West End, and we want to do everything we can to support the business and the communities there. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you. Don't forget, you can put your questions to Rachel. You can put them to her now. We've got some already coming in. But if you want to put a question to Rachel, all you need to do is go down to the bottom of your webinar window. There's a question mark icon there. Just click on that, put your question to her, and we'll come to you in due course. I want to kick off with a question from Paul. The question is this: businesses and residents in the West End agree on many things, but we only ever hear about the relatively small number of issues we sometimes disagree on. What can we do to make sure all our communities work better together to create an even better West End for everyone? Rachel.
Thank you. Actually, I think that's a really good question, and I've been really encouraged by the work that we've done over the last couple of months. We have, and particularly in a much more concentrated way the last couple of weeks, we have spoken and worked with and engaged very closely with both residents and the business community on how this would operate. We know that this will be more disruptive in some of the, Soho, we all know Soho as a place that we love to go to eat out and go to the bars, etc. But it's also, there's a significant resident community there. And what's been so encouraging through this is the wish of the resident community to support businesses to get off the ground. So I think there's a lot we can learn from how we've all worked together through this period. I think, you know, engagement is absolutely critical to this, and you know, having some give and take and understanding. Clearly, you know, people who live in Soho want to live there because there is a vibrant, buzzing atmosphere there, and so it's in everyone's interest to get the hospitality sector back up and running, but we have to also make sure there's the right balance.
Good. Question here from Councillor Jeff Barraclough. Outdoor markets could play an important role in the recovery. Will you rethink the increase in pitch prices for Berwick Street Market?
We have already, as Councillor Barraclough knows very well, waived all pitch fees during this period while they were unable to trade. So actually we've done a huge amount to support our market traders through this period, and we will continue to support them. And we've also, I should say, put in place a huge amount of other measures to enable them to safely trade around social distancing and all sorts of other measures to help them to get back up and running.
OK, there's a question here about what roads will be closed to support the hospitality and the F&Bs and the timings of those road closures. Can you give any more information on that?
There's probably the best thing, because there's over 50 specific schemes that are being mentioned, is if people just want to look on our website, they can see all of the roads that are mentioned. Some of these schemes won't need a road closure, but some of them will, and they'll be on a timed basis depending on the area. But what we are proposing is that from Monday to Friday, the roads will be closed from 5 p.m. until 11 p.m. And then on weekends, on a Saturday from noon until 11 p.m. and on a Sunday slightly earlier, noon until 10:30 p.m. So different timings at the weekend from during the week, but they will all be timed. And clearly also we need to work to coordinate freight and other deliveries within that, and indeed waste collections.
A question here, which is this and is as follows. In regard to the hospitality sector reopening, previously this was aimed at those with outdoor space. Will this now include those restaurants without outside space?
So this is aimed at all of our hospitality sector to enable them, where appropriate, to have tables and chairs outside on the pavement. So some of them might not have outside access at the moment, but this would enable them to do so. I should say, and actually I should have stressed at the beginning, that we are working very closely with government and lobbying very hard, but this is all dependent on the government relaxing legislation. At the moment, we are all governed by the Licensing Act 2003 and also by planning legislation, which will make it very difficult for us to enable any of the things that we want to do. We know the government is looking at this, and we are working and pushing very hard to make sure that they give us the flexibilities to do this, but it is still dependent on the government providing us with that flexibility. But we've made the announcement now because we want to give the sector enough time, as it were, to plan for what they can do. But we have to be honest that we are still dependent on the government providing us with the flexibilities we need.
OK, this question from Chris Shaw in Fitzwest. We support fully the reopening of the West End, but how can we be sure that any temporary measures will not become permanent arrangements and be the precedent that is used to extend licensing hours and pavement encroachments?
I think this is a very good question, and all I can say is that the reason that I have been fighting so hard in terms of lobbying government is to ensure that we do have the ability to issue temporary short-term licenses up to a year, but for periods much shorter than that, because we've been very clear. If the only thing that we were able to do were to be able to issue licenses, let's say for a year, then most of these schemes we would not be able to do, because going back to the question that was posed earlier about the resident and business community working in harmony side by side, clearly many of these measures the resident community will accept for a short-term period, but neither we nor the resident community would want them on a permanent basis, because, you know, we're talking about road closures and other things. We have to keep a city moving here. So these are things that could only work on a short-term basis in the vast majority of cases.
Okay, there's a question here which I'm going to put to you first, Rachel, and then I'm going to come to Jace because I think he's got some views which he'd like to share on it. And it's basically about air quality and people wanting to know what further measures in the long term you're looking at for air quality. And I know that I think you've mentioned that there are going to be a wider pavements and cycle routes, but these are temporary. Is there any chance of them becoming more permanent?
So I think, as I was saying earlier, what I would like to do, and there's a much wider piece of work around climate change and how we build our buildings and our existing housing stock as well, and the emissions from those buildings, which is a huge issue for us in Westminster, the biggest issue actually. But in terms of traffic on our roads, the long-term aim is absolutely to reduce the amount of traffic on our roads. It's not going to happen overnight, but that is absolutely what we want to be doing. As I mentioned earlier, what I hope we can deliver as a part of this is to move at a much more accelerated pace for how we can do things around freight and waste. For example, we have 65 different commercial waste companies operating in Westminster at the moment. If we were to get agreement to reduce that to 3. So if we had a framework and every business in Westminster, let's say, used one of those 3, we could reduce those commercial waste movements by 80%. So that would be a huge win. Businesses would still be able to get their waste collected in exactly the way they do at the moment, but we would be reducing the amount of movements on our streets dramatically. So I think there's a significant amount that we can do now. And I think that the last few months have shown us that change is possible. We've had to change over the last few months, but change is possible. And also, I think people have really appreciated the wonderful clean air that suddenly we're breathing in Westminster. And yes, we all understand the city needs to get up and moving again, and clearly we're going to need to have deliveries and things moving around again. But let's see if we can take some long-term wins from this. Let's
bring Jace in on that. Jace, are you with us still?
Yes, I think Rachel, actually, I think you touched on what I was going to ask, but I think this point is there probably are some temporary measures that could perhaps be more permanent to address that issue of clean air, less congestion. I think looking at Regent Street and the great work with the Crown Estate to actually widen the pavements now, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually take some of these measures that are really going to meet the long-term aim of the city to make it cleaner, to have less congestion, hopefully get more electric vehicles moving in the city. So it's really welcome to hear that you're thinking about this. And I know the bids, the great estates, the business community are really firmly behind you on this and really want to move at pace and really scale up some of the great work that's been happening already.
Okay, a question here from Jill. We need to create a great experience on Oxford Street for our West End visitors. Quality busking is part of this. Why is Westminster proposing just 2 busking places on the 2-mile Oxford Street, none east of Oxford Circus? Wouldn't it be better to identify areas where the noise may disturb residents and prohibit busking there, but allow quality buskers in all the other places? Rachel.
Thank you. And I know that the whole issue around street entertainment is a really important one, and it operates differently in all sorts of areas. As Jill may know, we've been looking at this really closely, and we are bringing forward policies for how we can manage this. There's a very fine balance between how we control this so that it's not a nuisance for residents or indeed anyone else, but also how you can have this as part of the entertainment, if you like, of a diverse city like Westminster. So there is a balance that we need to strike. For everyone who loves buskers, we also have a significant number that have huge problems and issues with amplified noise and all sorts of other issues. I take her point entirely about quality, the quality street entertainment, which is what we would hope for, and the policies that we'll be bringing forward are aimed to address that issue and to try and strike the right balance.
Okay, there's a question here from Simon Thomas from the Hippodrome, part of which is actually talking about busking. So I'm going to park that, Simon, and go to the bit about hospitality, because I think the busking has already been addressed. Hospitality, including the Hippodrome, is hoping to open on the 4th of July. With 2-metre distancing, it'll be challenging. Without notice, it will be even more expensive. We've had to bring staff off furlough already, despite not having an agreed date, which is risky. I'm guessing risky for them. What do you think will happen?
Hello, Simon. This is a good question. I think, look, I accept entirely. I think it's really difficult for businesses without certainty to know how to plan. And as I said earlier, that's why we've published our hospitality plans, even though we are still working to land the right legislative changes from government, because at least it's some certainty for the hospitality sector in terms of knowing where Westminster City Council is on this. But I can only say that I completely understand the difficulties around this. My own guess is that the 2-metre rule is likely to be changed. And I'm only saying that because it's being trailed so much in the press, and the way these things work is that the more they tend to get trailed in the press, the more likelihood is that that's what the government is thinking of doing, and they're seeing how the idea lands. So if I were a betting person, I would anticipate that sooner rather than later the 2-metre rule might be changed, but I don't know. But I think it probably is quite significant that the government's looking at it. They're also looking at international comparisons. As you know, there are many other European countries where they're operating at either 1.5 or at 1. So I think it's quite likely. Whether it will happen before the 4th of July, I don't know.
Okay, question from Lee here. He's talking about the congestion charge and the increase in the charge and the time coverage. And the question is, do you agree with that change? An interesting question here. What influence do you have over the decision making by the mayor?
Absolutely none.
I would have thought that was the case. You might have surprised us, I suppose. I'm guessing you're against the changes as well.
Yeah, look, as I've said earlier, we want to move towards a system where or an environment where the traffic on our roads reduces. So we don't want to encourage people to get into their cars. However, to extend the congestion charge into the evening and indeed at the weekend, at a time when we are desperately trying to get our city's businesses back off their knees, is an extraordinary thing to do. And I think particularly also at the moment, of course, we want to encourage everyone to get back onto public transport, to cycle and to walk. But let's be clear, not everyone is going to be able to do that. I talk all the time to people who have underlying health issues, older people, for whom it's just not practical. They are going to, for this period, and maybe they would have previously gone on the bus or whatever, but for this period, they are going to want to stay within the safety of their cars. So we know that there will be many people who will still need, actually, for their own circumstances, to be able to drive around the city. And so I think this is really an unfortunate, I'll be very diplomatic there, decision by the mayor. I think it impacts our businesses, it impacts many of our communities who can't travel around safely. And I think if I had some influence with the mayor, I would certainly try and persuade him to change his mind, but I don't think he's going to listen to me.
I think you probably got a little less influence after that answer, but we'll leave it there. Can you tell us, this is from somebody who is remaining anonymous, what's the plan for an integrated cycling infrastructure plan in the West End, including park, bikes, bike rentals, etc.?
I assume the person means how we approach our overall cycling system, with when she says he or she says park, bikes, etc., parking spaces for bikes. So as part of this, we've obviously introduced a huge amount of temporary cycle lanes, but we're also looking at on a more long-term basis about how we can encourage more cycling around the city, how we can encourage more cycling, how we can ensure that we have more parking for our cycles as well. which is really important. People need to be able to use those. So absolutely, we're looking at the whole thing of how we can encourage people to cycle around the city.
Okay, there's a very big question here from James. You're just about to spend £150 million on transforming the Oxford Street district. What is your vision for the West End? What do you want it to be like in 5 years' time?
That's a very interesting question, isn't it? I hope in 5 years' time that the West End will be somewhere where we will all want to visit, whether or not we're going to go shopping, but just to go for a day out, where I would, you know, my husband and I or my daughter and I or whoever would want to go for lunch or to go for, you know, just to go for a walk around, and the areas would be linked from the wonderful garden squares through to open up the fabulous architecture of some of those streets. So I hope that the West End will become an area where everyone, not just visitors, but all of us would want to visit, would think of immediately as somewhere we'd want to go, not just to go to, you know, to a park for a walk, but to say, okay, let's go and wander around these lovely squares in the West End. And also, obviously, if we wanted to go shopping, then clearly there's a venue there. But I hope that it would be that. I also hope that in 5 years' time, the Westminster residents would regard it as an area that they're really, and I'm sure they do already, but even more proud of, that they would say, you know, that when they have visitors, they say, we must take you to the West End and show you this fabulous new area. Look at these new measures that have been introduced around, you know, clever smart city things, or have you ever seen something as lovely as this or as clever as this? You know, wouldn't that be great? You know, so I hope that my children who are in their early 20s, who I have to say don't very often go to those shopping streets, I hope that in 5 years' time they're going to say to me, oh mum, you know, I met up with my friends on, you know, Regent Street to do this or that, or I met up, you know, wouldn't that be great, that it becomes an even stronger destination?
Okay, forgive me if we've covered this already, but there's a question here from somebody who hasn't given their name, but it's this: what is your view on alternative uses, including areas which historically have had a very rigid approach, e.g. special policy areas?
I think, I mean, in terms of our planning policy, we've obviously been very clear that we want to protect certain uses in certain areas, and I think that remains the council's view. However, as I was saying before, and I'm not talking about any specific ones, but I think as we come out of this, there may well be a lot of things that we need to look at over the next 5 years in terms of change of uses in our city. We don't know whether the numbers of people who used to commute into Westminster before to come to an office are going to continue to do so. We have a city where there are 250,000 residents, 250,000 residents, and then 1 million extra who came in every day to either work here or visit the wonderful attractions either through the day or the nighttime economy that we have in the city. We don't know yet how much of that will happen. One of the things I suspect may happen is, and particularly because there was already a movement in this direction from people working more flexibly from home, etc., is we may see that this accelerates that push. That, you know, I know from in City Hall we have a lot of officers, probably the majority, who live in the outer parts of London or out of London, so they have a significant commute in. If they're able to work more out of London than from home, then that means that we're going to need less office space, and it also means that there's an issue in terms of our F&B and other retail. So I think for us as a city as a whole, and this isn't just a West End issue, for a city as a whole, we need to be on the front foot and looking at how we use our city, how we encourage people back in, and we might need to be quite innovative about that.
Okay, question here from Lee. Do you really believe the new borough-wide 20 miles per hour speed limit is sensible and enforceable? The traffic already moves too slowly in London.
I do think it's sensible, and otherwise we wouldn't have implemented it. And I do think it's enforceable. I have to say there was a huge push towards this. Driven largely on health and safety grounds to prevent accidents, and so there was a huge drive towards push, I should say, rather than the pun of a drive, a huge push towards this from our residents who recognise that it would make our streets safer, and we've reflected that. I hope and very much hope that our residents will adhere to it and abide by it. It will make our streets safer, and I do not believe it will increase congestion in any way. In fact, the sad truth is that in quite a bit of our area, the traffic hasn't been moving more quickly than that anyway, so it will be a blanket issue across the city, but I think it will improve safety, and and particularly as we reduce some of the other traffic on our roads, it will help traffic to move around, but at a safer level.
Okay, Sabrina has a question here. The city plan is going into public inquiry. How will COVID-19 change your thinking on commercial space and flexibility of uses in the West End?
Well, Sabrina, I think, as I was just saying, actually, in the previous answer on protected uses, I think there may be, going forward, it's too early now in the city plan, but it may well be that in the future we will need to look at how quite a few of our uses are approached, because we don't know at this stage how demand for different types of property use will recover. So I think it may well be that we will need to look at this in the future, but clearly, as we're now going into the we're in the examination phase, as you know, at the moment, and into the public hearing. So the city plan is at a very late stage now, but in future years, I think we will need to address all of these things.
Forgive me if we've touched on this already, Rachel, but question here from David Shaw, and some thanks. Congratulations on keeping the services running through the COVID-19 epidemic. The F&B operators need your support. Could you allow temporary change of use for, say, the next 2 years, so restaurants can expand into adjoining retail units while they can't trade 100% of their existing space?
Thank you, David, for your comments about the space, about the keeping the city running. In terms of moving into retail space, I think that would actually cause problems in terms of the existing retail use. So I'm not sure how we would approach that in terms of different areas. I'm happy to take that away and think about it, but I'm not sure how that would work or how we could do that.
Another question here about transport. What are your plans to work with TfL to get people back into the West End on the tube?
Well, I think you know, we need TfL and public transport to be operating at normal levels, because clearly, you know, until people feel confident and safe enough about being able to go on the tube or the bus, it's going to be very difficult for us to get people back into some of our areas. We've done, as we were saying earlier, we've done a huge amount around encouraging people to feel safe cycling, etc. But it's not going to be practical for people to cycle in from Bexley or wherever unless they're very fit. So we need people to be able to feel confident about getting back on the tube and bus. We are, and in particular with our GLA member, Tony Devonish, we are working to lobby the mayor to get TfL services back up and running safely but clearly until social distancing also is amended, there's going to be an issue in terms of how many people can get back onto the bus. I mean, to give you an idea, our bus capacity, I know the question was about the tube, but our bus capacity with the current rules on social distancing, all of our bus capacity first thing in the morning will be taken up when children go back to school. So we need to, there is a significant issue here which can only really be addressed by more services, but also when the social distancing rules relax.
Okay, question from Catherine. With tourist traffic and a domestic recession likely over the next 12 months, occupancy costs are going to need to rebase permanently if Oxford Street is to avoid retailer flight once temporary support goes. Are you therefore lobbying for fundamental rates reform?
Yes, I think the business rates system, and we've long held this view, needs to be looked at again. And you know, as I was saying earlier, I think the fact that the Chancellor's announcement right in the budget, when he first announced business rates relief for retail, hospitality and leisure sector, the fact that it only benefited 5% of our businesses shows that the value of the property is disproportionately affecting them, and it's not a viable system going forward in my own view. So we would like the government to use this opportunity to review the whole business rate structure and see if they can come up with something that is more fit for purpose. And I also think, and this is really important for our high streets, for our international shopping centres like the West End, to look at how the balance between our physical shops and internet sales operates. How can we look at that and try and redress that? I know that's a difficult one, but that's why the government are operating at a higher pay grade. But actually, I think until we address some of those issues and look at how we spread some of the load between our physical retailers and the internet, it's going to be difficult in the long run for our physical retailers to survive. But actually we need them to, because it is a wonderful experience physically going shopping. It's a great way we spend time with our friends and others.
Okay, a question here from Ray from Edwardian Hotels. I'm just going to go for the first part of your question, Ray, because I think we've covered the congestion charging, which is the second part of your question. Given the importance of both domestic and international tourists to the UK, and particularly the benefits they bring to Westminster retail, restaurants and theatres, galleries and hotels, what will Westminster City Council be doing to support the new L&P campaign?
The new L&P campaign?
Yes. If you're not familiar with what the question is going for there, we can park it and move on to a different one if that would be easier.
Oh, Jace wanted to come in.
Jace, are you coming in?
Yes, just I think it's London and Partners, which is the tourism body, and there's a campaign which I think only launched a couple of hours ago, Rachel, so you might not have seen it yet, but it's basically, I think, a campaign to get Londoners to come out and support their high streets, their cities, and I think you've already done some excellent work with residents of Westminster to encourage them out. Of course, Bond Docks and Regent Street is their local high street as well in Westminster, isn't it? So let's hope we can have more of that support over the next year, particularly for Londoners to get back into the West End. So I think that's what Ray's referring to, Rachel.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I hadn't seen that announcement today, but I think it's a very good point. And do you know, I was going back to one of the comments I made right at the beginning. I think in my introductory comments, one of the hotels in my own ward has done a huge amount to help the community through this period, and I think it's really helped to embed them, if you like, in the local community. People know that they've done a huge amount, and I hope that it will mean that the local residents will support them more, because you're quite right, it's going to take a long time before international visitors come back, and so we need to do more to encourage our residents to come out and support these businesses. Interestingly, I know this isn't on the theme that you were asking about, but one of the things another thing that I'm trying to do is to look with our cultural institutions, and particularly the theatre sector, to see how we can promote theatres to our resident community, because at the moment a third of tickets are bought by international visitors and the vast majority by people who come in from out of London, and certainly not in Westminster. So while they're not able to come into, it's not as easy for them to return, certainly the tourists. What more can we do to reintroduce, if you like, our residents to the theatre, to grow that home base of people who could support these businesses? So I think what you're touching on is a really valid thing, and certainly something we've already been focused on, and I think it's something we need to do everything we can to encourage and support.
Okay, a couple of questions here on the issue of homelessness. One from somebody who's remaining anonymous, and another question from John, which is roughly on the same subject. We are seeing more and more rough sleepers returning to the streets of Westminster. Aren't we missing an opportunity to eradicate homelessness in the borough?
This is a very good question, and let me bring people up to speed on this, because it's always something that obviously we all of us would love to see eradicated. So before this crisis, we always had an acute problem with rough sleeping. At the beginning of this, we worked to move as many people as we could off the streets into emergency hotel accommodation, and we accommodated almost 250 people in emergency accommodation within the borough, and another 400 outside, funded by the GLA. And the numbers on our streets, the people that you saw remaining on our streets, were those who either refused, we know we have a very entrenched cohort, who refused to come off the street and go into accommodation, or later on during the crisis, we saw more people coming on, particularly Romanian, Polish people who we think had probably lost jobs on construction sites or whatever, and so ended up on the streets. So what's happening now, and you're quite right, there's a real opportunity here. We are working really hard to move all of those who've been moved temporarily into the emergency hotels but through accommodation pathways, either into the private rented sector or into hostels, but also link them with jobs, and that's working really well. So already we've moved almost 80, linking many of them with jobs, but into other types of accommodation. We're experimenting with different ways of trying to link people with jobs. So one of the great things, the Westminster Property Association is helping us by advertising 50 jobs for people that we have in our hotel accommodation, former people who had no recourse to public funds but had experience of working on construction sites. So we are moving people through the system but being absolutely clear that what we do not want is people to go back onto the streets. And we're also looking with government at how we can find much more sustainable pathways long term for them. Just as a point, in terms of the numbers on the streets at the moment, what is really interesting is that the numbers have fallen significantly. Our last count at the weekend actually saw a dramatic drop to only 39, which we think is the very entrenched cohort. But what we are unfortunately seeing is the return of the daytime begging cohort, the street population who are not rough sleeping. They have accommodation elsewhere. These people will typically have accommodation elsewhere. They'll come back, and unfortunately I can tell you that what will be happening is they'll be coming back because the retail's reopening, and of course the hospitality is about to reopen, so there are more people about, so there's more opportunities. But we will work with all of these people, but I completely agree with you. I think we have an opportunity to really drive down rough sleeping rates and to help people to move on to jobs and other forms of accommodation.
Okay, question here. What can you do about the aggressive tactics adopted by the questionable wristband and magazine sellers claiming to be raising awareness about knife crime? They are already back and terrorising shoppers with their approach and are not following any social distancing measures.
Right. Well, what I'd say is if you have examples of where they are, and certainly if you let me know after the call or via Jace where this is, we can certainly send our city inspectors and work with the police to address that, because clearly that's not acceptable. We can work with that.
Okay, there's a question here from Matthew, and he acknowledges that this is a national planning question, but would you or could you support flexible planning use to reflect changes in retail and consumer habits? For example, a unit which could be used in part as a cafe, shop, gym and other uses in a single and flexible use.
Well, we've actually already made our planning policies much more flexible in, for example, around Oxford Street, so that a number of the units have got all sorts of other uses within them. So we have already done that to address that, and it's quite possible that we could roll it out to other areas. But certainly already on Oxford Street, we have adopted a much more flexible planning policy, and I think that's landed very well in terms of helping businesses.
really, I think a very important question here, and this will actually be our last question. The theatres are in crisis. What is Westminster City Council doing to support them, given the critical role they play in the borough's economy?
I agree. This is a really important question. By chance, I happened to have one of my regular meetings this morning was with the Society of London Theatres, and you're absolutely right. The theatre industry is really suffering. It's going to take a long time for it to be able to recover, because obviously for people to feel confident about sitting in such close proximity with social distancing of any kind, really, even if we go down to a metre, it just doesn't work. The money that's involved to put on productions, it's just not going to be tenable. So it is a really difficult issue. I completely agree. We need to do everything we can to get the theatre industry back up and running. We are doing what we can. What I've talked about is two things. So first of all, we've been very clear that just as we have with the hospitality sector and indeed the retail sector, that when theatres are able to open, we want to work with them to put in place any temporary measures that we can around the public realm to support them, but also we've been looking and talking with them about a sort of inside-out cultural offer, which would be to highlight the work of the theatres. I'm not exactly sure how this will work, but it's something that we're talking to them about. Many of you will be very familiar with a fabulous event that Westminster's held for years in conjunction with the London Theatres, the West End Live. It's actually going ahead again this year at the end of this month on the usual weekend, but in virtual form. So do look out for that on our website, and make sure you log on to the Facebook page to watch that. It's a compilation of the best bits of the last few years, I think, but I'm sure it'll still be fabulous. But that obviously works to highlight the wonderful richness of the theatre industry, and we would love to do something, but clearly on a much reduced scale, just to replicate that sort of idea. So I don't know exactly how we could do that, but Westminster City Council controls some great spaces, the North Terrace of Trafalgar Square, all sorts of other spaces, and you know, we'd love to use those to showcase some of that in whatever way we can.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed for that answer, for all your answers, and for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking your time out, and thank you for joining us and asking questions. Our guest next week is Kate Nichols, who is the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality. Kate has been working tirelessly throughout the pandemic to ensure that the UK's pubs, restaurants and hotels are supported by government and are ready in a few weeks' time to reopen safely and viably. She'll update us on the latest situation as the hospitality sector prepares to reopen at the beginning of next month. Join us if you can on Wednesday, the 24th of June at 4 p.m. Thank you for now for joining us. Goodbye.